Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to use this just to introduce Bill, so it'll be on the recording. I know I didn't get to hear him last week because I was not well, and I appreciate Nancy stepping in for me. But Bill's a longtime friend. We both came to Kansas City in 1989 to teach at Midwestern Seminary back in the day. And then he moved on to Rockhurst, where he is now the emeritus professor of religious studies and theology. And we've had a really good time. We were here 2 weeks ago when nobody came except Marita. And so that night and tonight, we got to go out to eat and talk and catch up. And so it's really great to be with Bill. And he's a really good scholar and teacher. And so hopefully we'll have some good questions for him about communion. And Bill, thanks for being here.
Okay, good. Thank you, Mike. And it's good to be back. Well, we're going to do the same format we did last week. I've got a bunch of questions, issues that unite Christians with communion, issues that divide Christians. And I'll let you, I'm going to read these to you or with you so you can see the overview of what the questions are. And then I want to start with a question I did not put on your handout. Mm-hmm. So here are the questions we're looking at. Administration of communion, who presides, who distributes. Frequency of communion, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or not at all. There are a couple of denominations that don't have sacraments. The elements of communion: wine, grape juice, water, bread, leavened bread, unleavened. The vessels of communion: common cup, individual containers. Posture at reception: standing, kneeling, sitting. Nature of the service: celebratory, solemn, corporate, individual. Connection with salvation: sacramental, non-sacramental. Communion and church discipline: appropriate, inappropriate. Baptism and communion: required or not. Open and closed communion: how open, how closed. Devotional practices: exposition of the sacrament, monstrance, tabernacle processions. That really relates to the Roman Catholic Church, number 11. And we can talk about that if you want to later. Let me start with one I didn't put on there, just to kind of get us going, and then you can tell me which direction you're going. So I've referred to this as communion all throughout, but that's not the only name for the ritual, is it? There are other names, and so I thought I'd do just a little quick survey of these other names, where they come from, and why they're used. Let's got some more handouts here. Mike, I'm going to let you be my handout person here as people come in.
That's good.
Okay, so one of the terms that is probably most common is the phrase Lord's Supper. And that appears in the writings of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, where he's actually chastising this church for the way that they're practicing this ritual of communion. And we'll get into that more later, but he says, I cannot commend you on the way you're practicing the Lord's Supper, because they were practicing it selfishly. And he's trying to make the point, this is the supper that belongs to the Lord. It's not just your meal. It is the supper of the Lord. So that's a common term used for this ritual, Lord's Supper. I find the term mostly used in evangelical churches. They'll usually call it Lord's Supper. Another term is breaking of bread. This appears a number of times in the New Testament, though I'm not sure always it refers to communion, sometimes maybe not. But for example, in the second chapter of Acts, after you had this mass conversion of persons to Christianity on the day of Pentecost, it says that they gathered together and stayed and followed the teachings of the apostles, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. And that seems to have been the participating in this ritual that we're discussing. Now, the term communion which is a term that I've used in your handout, and is a pretty common term among the mainline Protestant churches. This seems to be the most common term. That also comes from one of Paul's writings, again in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says there, the cup that we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? And the word he uses for communion is a Greek word, koinonia, which can be translated fellowship, communion, participation. So the cup that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we bless, is it not a participation or communion in the body of Christ? So you have that term that is widely used.
Bill?
Yes?
You might want to know that almost everybody in here is a member of the Koinonia.
Because
Sunday
Sunday
school
school,
class.
that's
Oh.
the name of our.
Oh, okay. Well, then you're familiar with the term.
Yes.
Participation, fellowship, communion, all of those are possible translations of that term. Now, another term that is used in some of the more liturgical churches is Eucharist, the Eucharist. And this also is a term from the Bible. It literally means to give thanks. And it refers back to the Lord's Supper when Jesus celebrated the Passover meal. It says that he gave thanks. The word is Eucharisteo in Greek. He gave thanks, he broke it, and then he distributed it. And so Eucharist is a term that's widely used in the Catholic Church, Orthodox churches, Episcopal, Lutheran, those churches in particular would use Eucharist. Now, I grew up in the Baptist church, and we always called it the Memorial Supper, the Memorial Supper. And that harkens back to what Jesus said, do this in memory of me. So all of these terms are biblical, and one is maybe not any better than the other. They all point us in a little bit different direction towards the ritual. A couple of other terms that are not in the Bible, but you'll also hear in the Catholic Church, the Mass, right? It's referred to as the Mass. And that comes from the days when the Mass was said in Latin, and the ending of the Mass was ite missa, which means be dismissed, go home, okay? Ite missa, and missa became the Mass, okay? And then in the Orthodox churches, Greek, Russian, the various branches of Orthodoxy, they refer to it as the Divine Liturgy, the Divine Liturgy. And they emphasize the root meaning of the word liturgy, which literally means the work of the people. It's their meal, but it's a holy meal. So they call it the Divine Liturgy, okay? So all of those are possible names. Again, all the ones I mentioned except Mass and Divine Liturgy are found in the Bible, but they tend to connect themselves to different denominations, right? Some feel more comfortable. I mean, if you walked into a Baptist church and said, are you having the Eucharist today?
No.
I would go, I don't know, is that contagious? You know, is that like COVID? You know, so some feel more comfortable with certain terms. Okay, you've had a chance to see what's on your list. So where do you want to start? Any order that you want to start in? Somebody throw out one and we'll see what we come up with. Which one?
Number one.
Number one, administration of communion. Who presides, who distributes? Well, there's nothing really in the Bible about this, you know. But again, what has happened is churches tend to have different traditions. Most of the churches that are out of what we call the free church tradition, such as yours, the congregational polity and the way they organize, anybody can preside or distribute because the church is the one authorizing those people to preside and distribute. Practically speaking, it tends to be the ordained ministers who do the presiding, but it doesn't have to be. It can be anyone. Now you get into the churches that are more hierarchical, or also have leadership that involve large groups of people, such as what's called a presbytery in the Presbyterian Church. They have some more strict rules about who can preside. For example, in my church, the Episcopal Church, I cannot preside at the Eucharist. I'm not an ordained minister in the Episcopal Church, so I cannot preside. I can distribute, and I have many times. I can distribute the bread and the wine. But as far as consecrating and blessing the elements, I'm not allowed to do that. So you have a little bit of a divide here between traditions, and it goes back mostly to those that practice congregational polity, where they authorize anyone, versus the churches that have a more formal structure, and they require typically the ordained minister to be the one to do the presiding. Yeah. Comments or questions on that? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, I'm using my voice. I've got one that's not on your list.
Okay, fire away.
This comes in response to an email I got from a friend of mine that lives in Texas, whose wife is a kind of fallen Catholic. And the term that they use is transubstantiation.
Mm-hmm.
And he said you wouldn't believe, unless you saw what happens after the service is over in their kitchens, the rituals that they go through with respect to the wine and what they call the host,
Mm-hmm.
because they actually believe that it's turned into blood.
Right.
And of course, anybody with a modicum of training in chemistry would be able to falsify that in 5 minutes, you know. So it seems to me there's a lot of cognitive dissonance around in the background there. I'd like for you to comment on that.
Well, let me address that and try to address it in sort of a systematic way so we can see where that view comes from and how others may hold something somewhat similar but not exact in how that varies in different churches. So I would say you could pretty much put most churches under 3 different views here. So one view is that when you take the wine and the bread, or the grape juice and the bread, that Christ is actually really present there in the bread and the wine. Not that the bread is turned into the body of Christ, or that the
No,
wine.
that's not what he said, though.
I know, but I'm getting to yours.
Okay.
Hold on. I'm getting to yours. That's called the real presence. And you would find that view in Lutheran churches, in Episcopal churches like mine. Okay? That Christ is really present, not just symbolically, but that he is there on the altar in the elements. Now, this is where the Catholic Church differs in that view. They actually hold to a theory called transubstantiation. It was first defined in the year 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. And what that theory says is simply this, that the external properties of the bread and wine do not change. External properties they call the accidents. That's from language from Aristotle. So when a Catholic takes communion, it tastes like bread, it still tastes like wine, it smells like bread. The external properties don't change. But they argue that the inner essence, the substance, actually becomes the body and bread of Christ. The body and blood of Christ. So your analogy about the chemical analysis wouldn't really hold up for them, because they would argue that, sure, chemically it's still bread and wine, but the inner essence has now become the body and blood of Christ. Now that's where that view differs from groups like the Orthodox Church, Episcopal, and Lutheran. They don't believe that the bread and wine actually changes into the body and blood of Christ, but they believe Christ is actually really present there. Now, a lot of groups, mainline Protestant groups, would argue for what they would call a more symbolic presence That is, that the bread and the wine represent the body and blood of Christ, that there is a mystical element there, that we share and participate in the life of Christ, but they wouldn't necessarily argue for a real presence. And then a third group would argue that the point of communion is not the presence of Christ at all. It is done in memory of his death. And the point of it is to stimulate the memory, to remind you of the death and resurrection. Now, one of the things about your comment, and then we'll see what other questions you have. Groups like Lutheran, Episcopal, and Catholic and Orthodox, because they take very seriously this real presence, they are going to treat the bread and wine differently than you're going to see in some other churches. So, for example, in my church, and this would be true of the Catholic Church also, if the minister has some bread left over or wine left over, he can do one of three things. He can consume what's left, okay, or the ones helping him serve, the servers. They can consume the excess wine or bread. Or there's also what's called an ambry. It's a recessed area in the wall behind the altar with the door locked, and you can store it in the ambry. Or back in the sacristy, another room where they prepare the elements and the vestments are kept, there's a special sink called a piscina. And that sink has a pipe that goes into the ground so that the wine returns to the ground from which it was taken, the grapes. And so they can do one of those three things with the
But that's in the, you said that's Lutheran, Episcopal, and so forth.
Lutherans, Episcopal, Catholics,
We put it in the
Orthodox.
freezer, by the way.
I'm sorry?
We put it in the freezer, by the way. In the freezer in the sacristy. Because we're practical.
I used a number of books from the library in preparation to pray at the table, and remembrance and memory, it's a theme through almost all of those.
Mhm.
Is that uniquely disciples or very common, or is it just the authors of
That's
those?
what he said.
No, it's pretty common in lots of traditions. Memory will be one, Thanksgiving will be one, fellowship or participation will be one. It's kind of like all those words that Bill was saying. These are kind of the most common themes that the New Testament picks up. And so it just depends who wrote it as to whether they've latched on more to the memory as opposed to Thanksgiving, or, there's even a Lamb's Supper imagery too, of kind of an eschatological banquet in the end.
Nancy?
Yeah, I'm curious why you say it's the memory of his death and resurrection. Nobody's told me this, it's just, whenever you do this, do it in memory of me. I've always taken that as in memory of the things that he taught, in memory of what he was trying to accomplish on earth, bringing God's kingdom to earth.
Yeah.
So I hadn't ever thought of it just in terms of that's part of what he did, but not all of it.
Right. Well, I want to stress that your church and other churches, they don't have a piscina and they don't do all that. And the leftover, I don't know, you may give it to the kids or just pour it out. But you're not being
serious.
But you're not being irreverent. That's my point. Is that reflects your understanding of communion, that it is in memory, it stimulates the memory, it brings about fellowship and so on. So one of my favorite theologians is Alistair McGrath, an Anglican, but he gets real snarky on this question. He refers to this third viewpoint of memorialism as the real absence of Jesus. And he knows better than that. He knows that's not what you're saying, that God has abandoned you in the communion. But I try to point out to my friends who don't understand that other churches, dispose of the elements differently, that again, it's not an act of irreverence if you don't see it as the real presence of Christ, that it has a different a different meaning.
One of my colleagues at the seminary at St. Paul, he was Lutheran, he would be offended if after everybody had come forward, if there were crumbs
Mhm.
on the floor.
Yeah, they're very careful about that. When I was in the Army back in 1970, what MOS they call it, your military occupation specialty, was church. I was typist. I was a typist. Okay, that's what my daughter always said. Yeah, you fought the Vietnam War with a typewriter. But I got assigned to a chaplain, a Catholic chaplain, and so I would help him set up mass and all this. And the chapel was in an old World War II chapel. This was in southern Alabama, and it was just loaded with cockroaches everywhere. You couldn't imagine, humid. And one day, I'm always sitting on the front row to help him, if he needs some help or something. And he's up there doing mass. He holds up the chalice, and two beady eyes look at him from the chalice. Reaches in there, throws it over his head. So I asked him about it later. I said, did you transform that cockroach into the body and blood of Christ? And he said, I don't know if I did or not, but I was getting out of there. So I was curious about that. Later when in seminary, I got curious about that. And it turns out the Roman Catholic position is that anything that's in there gets transformed. Mm-hmm. And if foreign matter gets in, you're supposed to burn it or put it down that sink, that basement. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't supposed to throw it away. Okay,
I have a question. Number 5, posture and reception. And this is a variant, if I could. I'm thinking more the preparation for communion. The individual, are there any religions that have a more structured, we have prayers beforehand. Mm-hmm. Are there others that are more prescriptive on preparing yourself? Somewhere I got the idea that for Catholics to take communion, they had to have gone through confession.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. The preparation for communion. In fact, Mike and I were talking about this week about that. We emailed back and forth on a couple of things on this, and there's a passage in 1 Corinthians 11 where Paul says, "Examine yourself," and we were talking about the meaning of that, and the context for this whole issue that was going on in 1 Corinthians 11 was what was called at the time an agape meal, a love feast. And this, apparently the way they practiced communion, at least up into the year 210, and I'll tell you why I dated, to 155, I'll tell you why I dated it that way in a minute, was that communion was an actual meal together, a fellowship meal, either provided by the host there or more like a potluck where people brought things. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul chastises these people. He calls them hereses, which is the word heretics, and he calls them stigmata, which is the word's divisions. And he says, you're dividing the church because some of you are coming early and you're eating all the food and getting drunk. Now, I don't know anybody that get drunk on a little sip of wine. So this is a full meal. This is an agape meal. And then he said, others who come later who are left needy and they don't have anything. He says, don't you have houses where you can drink and eat in? He says, that's in the context in which he says, this is the Lord's Supper. This is the supper that belongs to the Lord. And then he says, examine yourself so that you can discern the body of Christ. The body of Christ referring to the church. Make sure you're not misusing this ritual. And so Mike and I were talking about this, how that phrase self-examination in that passage probably refers to get your thinking straight about this meal. It has come to mean, however, also the idea that each person should examine herself or himself before taking communion. And that's done in different ways. In some churches, there will be kind of a general confession of sins in the service itself. Sometimes it's at the beginning of the service. Sometimes it's just before you take communion. Other churches will just read that passage and say, examine yourself, and then you would do so before you go forward or take it at your seat. In the Catholic Church, you mentioned going to confession. The actual canonical rule in the Catholic Church is that you're supposed to go to confession at least once a year. Once a year. And so, but again, nobody is checking your confessional punch card. Yeah, nobody's checking that, but that's actually the rule in the Catholic Church.
We even have one hymn in our hymnal, particularly that I read frequently, and it's about making yourself in the right frame of mind,
Yeah.
removing those thoughts from you.
Yeah, here's the thing. The problem is there's a balance here. Back in the Middle Ages, it got to the point where people wouldn't even take communion but maybe once a year because they were so afraid they were taking it with a sin on their soul. And that's the other extreme, where you think, well, oh, I'm not worthy. Well, okay, we're never worthy, but that's the whole point. You examine yourself, you ask forgiveness of your sins, you take communion. And so it's been a change really in the 20th century where churches have stressed more and more the take communion. Communion is an important thing to nurture your soul and not to just beat yourself up on what you think you've done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mhm.
That's
The
the
number
East
4, to go along with what the question number 4, go along with what you were saying. If it's a common cup, and the person in front of me hasn't gone to confession, then does that contaminate the cup?
No, that issue was settled back in the 4th century. There was a controversy back in the 4th century about ministers who offered the cup and maybe they themselves were not really pure. And this controversy was settled. Look, the way it's worded is the efficacy, the effectiveness of the sacrament is not dependent on the purity of the minister or the person in front of you taking the cup. In other words, the sacrament is what God does. You can't control. It'd be sort of like saying, in some religions, marriage is a sacrament. It'd be like saying, well, okay, the priest who married you really wasn't a good priest, so you're not really married. No, the sacrament is effective because God is the one who is working in the sacrament. So the one in front of you, if that person takes it unworthily, it doesn't contaminate the sacrament. But along that same lines about the question of common cup and so on, a lot of churches do use a common cup as a way to symbolize unity. Now, there are other ways you can symbolize unity also. Even with individual cups, you can wait and everybody takes it at the same time and so on. The common cup, some churches will allow you to either take the drink or they'll allow you what's called intinction, where you dip it in there. The Roman Catholic Church does not allow intinction. You either take a sip of the cup or you can bypass the cup completely, because the theory is if you get the body, you get the blood also. Compared to the human body, the body contains the blood, so you get them both. So you can do that. Now, the one that you may not be familiar with is how the Eastern Orthodox distributes their communion. They have a whole ritual prior to the divine liturgy where the priest is back in the sacristy and he has a large loaf. They use leavened bread in the Eastern Church. And he cuts that loaf into different sections saying different prayers. And what he does is when communion time comes is he takes the communion, he breaks it up and puts it into the chalice of wine. Forms this big soggy mess. And when you come forward for communion, he has a spoon and he spoons it into your mouth. Now, if he's pretty good, he can get it in there without really the spoon touching your lips. But that's how they take communion in the Eastern Church. And they do have closed communion, only those who are Orthodox can take communion. Or Catholic, they'll accept Roman Catholics also. Yeah.
Churches I was in South Africa, you couldn't take communion if you hadn't paid your pledge.
If you hadn't paid your pledge.
You had to come and give your offering.
Well, again, I don't know anybody that's checking their certificates before they give
They
communion.
did there. You went up and you paid your money to that person there and they checked you off. And then you could come up and take communion.
Too far from our stewardship.
Think you're gonna try that again, huh? Okay, another question.
What do you mean by number, communion and church discipline appropriate and inappropriate?
Well, this goes back to the early church, and it's still practiced today in some groups, and that is they deny communion to some people as a form of church discipline.
Oh, I see, okay, that's what you're.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this was practiced pretty widely early on in Christianity, and it may be more understandable when Christianity was a persecuted religion, and you had to be pretty serious to really be in the church, And so anyone who was bringing some sort of infamy to the church, they would be disciplined in a lot of different ways. In the year 325, the bishops from all over the empire met in what today would be Turkey, right outside of Istanbul, Nicaea. And they, in addition to forming a creed, they also passed a lot of laws that are called canon laws. And Canon 11 explains how you discipline people who have committed serious sins, mortal sins. There were 3 sins in particular: murder, apostasy, denying the faith, and adultery. And so if you committed any of those 3 sins and then were repentant, brace yourself, it took you as much as 12 years to get back into the church. This canon law outlines that they had different levels. For example, your first level is you would be what they called a weeper. You had to stand outside the community in the rain, wherever, and weep for your sins. That went on 2 or 3 years. And then finally you got brought into the narthex, the vestibule, and you were called a hearer. You could hear whatever you could hear, but that was it. And then you were brought in and you could be a kneeler. You could kneel down, but you were dismissed when the communion was done. And then finally, you could watch the communion, but you still couldn't take communion. And all that went on about a dozen years before you would be restored. So the refusal to allow communion was used as a way of disciplining people. Now, today, it's pretty rare to hear of that, except in some churches like the Amish, where the Amish will ban people. They have a shunning and banning, for people who have sinned, and until you repent, they will not let you take communion. Occasionally, you'll hear of a very conservative Catholic bishop who will not allow a person to take communion, particularly a politician maybe who's spoken out, in favor of abortion or something like that.
I did that
Yeah.
one. Somebody did it with Biden.
Yeah, up in Omaha, the bishop up there denied communion to one of their senators, I believe, who was a Catholic in support of abortion rights. And so, but you don't hear a lot of it today. And honestly, some of it has to do with legal issues. I mean, I read of one fundamentalist church in Florida a few years ago that a preacher called somebody out for their sins from the pulpit and got sued for defamation. So you never know. But you don't hear a lot about communion being used as a disciplinary tool today. It's not nearly as common today.
Sort of amazing that Christianity has survived.
In spite of this.
Yeah, it makes you think it's almost divine. Maybe it's of the Lord. Huh? Let's talk about this number 9, because last time you wanted to talk about it, and I said, I'll wait till Mike gets here so we can have equal time. He and I don't always see it the same light on this. Baptism and communion, required or not. Most churches do require baptism. This was the practice of the early church. Baptism was required, and it certainly made sense when the church was persecuted that for you to even be a part of a church required, again, pretty firm commitment. Today, there certainly has been a movement in some of the mainline Protestant churches to move away from this. In my church, in the Episcopal Church, there was a motion that went into the committee at our last convention last summer to allow anyone to take communion, baptized or otherwise, but it never got out of committee, so it never even got voted on. There are churches that go against their church's official policy and do it anyway. Again, in my church, my pastor's not going to check your baptismal certificate when you come forward, nor Catholic priests for that matter. They're not going to be checking your baptismal certificate, so they leave it up to the individual. Now, Mike, you can help me on this. I know that in Mike's book, Table Talk, you talk about the context of early communion might have something to do with the old symposium. Explain that a little bit, if you will.
Yeah, so when Jesus comes along, he obviously doesn't reinvent eating. He's a product of the culture, and because the Mediterranean world has been influenced by Alexander the Great and by the Romans, the Greco-Roman banqueting is the way people eat. And that meal, the meal is called a deipnon, but the symposium is the name of the talk afterwards. Literally, the word symposium means drinking with, which most people don't think of that. But if you've ever been to a symposium, a lot of people go out to drink afterwards. But so it was a banquet meal, like Bill talked about. It could be hosted by somebody or a potluck, and then they would kind of have a second part of the evening where they're going to have the discussion and play some games too, but they're going to keep drinking. And this, unfortunately, was a time when often children and women were excused to be a part of the second part of the night.
Yeah, and also the Jewish Passover ritual allowed anyone to participate. I know my wife and my daughter and I lived in Argentina for 7 years, and my daughter at the time was young, and she became friends with a little Jewish girl, and she was invited to the Passover meal, and so she went to the Passover meal. So that's sort of another argument that drawing from both the Greco-Roman symposium concept and then that of the Jewish Passover, all are welcome.
So, Bill, do you remember this story that Robert Canoy used to tell? Robert Canoy taught with us at the seminary, and his dissertation, I wish I could remember which one of the church fathers. I want to say Irenaeus, but I don't know. He practiced, whoever it was, practiced the notion of evangelistic Eucharist, that you would invite non-Christians in the empire to come and taste and see that God is good. And Canoy, who taught about this, he was on a retreat at one of the Catholic retreat centers over, kind of Leavenworth direction. And he was doing a retreat for a church on this topic. And they went to the cafeteria, and when they got back, he noticed that they had somebody else in the group now that had just followed them after eating and came back in there, and they closed this weekend by having communion. And this woman said, I have never had communion or been a part of a church, but I saw all of you eating and having fun, and I followed you, and then I just now ate this meal. So the very topic that he was talking about actually lived out in this woman who came to faith through the Eucharist.
Yeah, it'd be hard to deny somebody's that in a case like that. Yeah. The counter argument goes back again to the purpose of baptism, which is it's a ritual of initiation, bringing you into the church. There's no doubt in the early church baptism was considered to be required for baptism. This is found in document after document. I think that I think the whole business of leaving people out is something we have to examine, and maybe I would argue solve in other ways. I've heard people say, in fact, I think somebody said it last week, you know, it looks bad when our children, but that argument doesn't really faze me because there's a lot of things we leave our children out of. We just tell them you're not old enough to have a cell phone when you're 5, you know. So, you know, you don't tell, well, you know, you'll take Lord's Supper when you're baptized, and they postpone a lot of things in life. So that doesn't really bother me that children feel left out. My grandson who lives with me, he's off to college now in Boston, but he lives with me, and he's not baptized, and he goes with me to church when he's here, and he doesn't take communion. He feels okay. He doesn't feel left out. He's loved by the church. They love him. He loves them. So I would just simply argue, I don't doubt that there is a strong argument to be made as a kind of a tool of evangelism or welcoming all people, but I would continue to argue that baptism, it's what sociologists call boundary, sort of boundary theory, where all groups have boundaries of some sort. Sometimes they're not, sometimes they're just mental, what you include and what you don't include. And this is one of those boundaries that I think Christianity has correctly imposed. But again, I acknowledge there are good arguments on both sides. And again, I think I could probably make a case for Mike's argument too, because I've read his book. And his book is
I
convincing.
figure if Judas and Peter get to eat it, one's betrayed and one's denied,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, it's like one time I read this statement. I forgot who said it. I wish I could remember, but he said, "In the great marriage feast of the Lamb, when we all get there, the person seated on your right side is going to be the person who has most offended you, and the person on your left side, the person you most offended." Yeah. So that's pretty
That's the
sober.
beauty of religious plurality, because if the group you're in doesn't like you and says go somewhere else, you can do
True enough. Yeah, go ahead.
it. So it's kind of a
Well-
feedback mechanism.
Growing up in the disciple church in Jefferson City, it was very clear. It was a policy. I don't know that it was, I didn't have many rules for it, but you got to take communion after you were baptized. It was a big deal. Here, when I first started going to church here 46 years ago, I one time carried my 3-year-old out screaming from the front row because we wouldn't let her take communion because that was sort of the policy. It changed over the years with probably a big nudge from Mike, but before that even, because at community camp in Colorado, all the kids took communion and were expected to, but then they'd come back here and they weren't expected to. But I've always thought that, I mean, the fact that you're baptized doesn't make you good or bad. It's you inside and what you do and how you act and love others. And so somebody's baptized, you might want to, if you had the say, you might say, nope, you're over here. And I figure that's just between you and God if you aren't baptized. So,
Well, that is one way to look at it, again, that it's a personal matter, but you also have to remember that Christianity is not just a personal religion. It may be personal, but it's not private. You know,
No.
there's a community involved, and you're baptized into a community, and you come to the church to find your salvation. You don't just announce it, you know, it's here that you find it.
but if you have the dedication, maybe dedication, and blessing of little children, we used to call it,
Mhm.
you've been welcomed into the church. You
Right.
haven't joined because
Yeah.
here, but you've been welcomed into the church.
Well, yeah, and again, these blessing ceremonies of children, they're important. I mean, they're a recognition that you need some ritual to commemorate this new birth and that this new person into the community. But that's not baptism.
No, it's not.
It's not. And
Would this have been an issue in 1950?
Yeah.
This baptism, communion, would that discussion have even been happening?
probably not. I doubt it. I mean, again, it was just assumed that, you know, you would be baptized first. Let's go, we got about 20, 15 minutes, maybe some other ones if you don't have ones, some I'll pull out. Maybe you want to talk about open communion, closed communion, number 10. That's a big one in a lot of churches. Open communion, I guess what we've been talking about is how open are you going to be? You know, you're going to take unbaptized also, but typically those terms have referred to how denominations accept others into their church and receive them and allow them to take communion. Most mainline Protestant churches practice open communion, so that if you're Lutheran, you can take communion in the community of Christ, in Disciples of Christ. If you're Episcopal, you can take communion in Presbyterian Church. The churches that practice closed communion would be the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, and then some of the more fundamentalist churches like the Lutheran Missouri Synod, which is the real conservative branch of Lutheranism. In fact, they're so conservative, they will not even let a Lutheran from another Lutheran denomination, take communion. You have to be in their tribe, to take communion. The big issue here, and the Mormons, by the way, also have close communion. The big issue here is, for me, does communion create unity, or is unity required before you take communion? And I want to read you a verse from 1 Corinthians 10, which to me resolves this problem, though the Catholic Church doesn't see it that way. I quoted part of it earlier. Cup of blessing we bless is not a sharing. Is it not a sharing in the blood of Christ? The bread we break, is it not a sharing in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. That for we all could be because we all. It's the Greek word gar. Could be because. So, because we all partake of one bread, therefore we who are many are one body. And so it seems to me this verse is saying that the communion creates the unity, and that there doesn't have to be a unity prior to communion. Communion will create it. And so I would argue that open communion makes the most sense. And again, that's going to be what is practiced by most churches, and even most evangelical churches practice open communion. Baptist churches and groups like that are typically going to practice open communion.
Didn't used to.
Yeah, it depends on the kind of Baptist, Yeah, there certainly are Baptists that don't. Yeah, and maybe where you're from Arkansas originally, you say. Yeah, maybe in some areas
It only came up 4 times a year, so.
That's true. That's true.
Well, it even went so far as if we went to a church visiting, that was another Southern Baptist church, and we weren't members, and they were having communion, we did not partake unless we were invited by the minister.
Yeah, that's that old, what was that thing called in Baptist life? Those fundamentalists, that back in Gray's, J.R. Gray's.
Oh, the landmark?
Landmark, they were called Landmark Baptists.
No, I
Yeah, they were, that you had to be, that was really close communion. You had to be in that particular church.
But does the Catholic Church, or at least historically, might not consider us really saved or Christians or whatever?
What's your question, Nancy?
Well, it's a matter of you can't take communion because you haven't really been baptized, or you are really a believer.
No, though they believe you've really been baptized. They accept any baptism, as long as it's Trinitarian. So it's not that you're lacking baptism. Their argument is that in order to take communion, you have to be in unity with them in their church. And so, I taught 25 years at a Catholic university, And so I was at lots of masses, you know, for different things. And there were other faculty who were non-Catholic like myself, and some of them would get mad at the Catholic Church about that and say, by golly, I'm taking communion. You're not going to stop me. They go forward and take communion. And again, the priest doesn't check their ID. I mean, and most of the priests there were Jesuits teaching at the school, and they knew they weren't Catholic, but they're going to go ahead and serve me. But I always felt again that even though I didn't agree with that policy, that was their policy, and I would honor it. So I didn't take communion at these Catholic masses. And if you're not going to take communion, you can always go forward and cross your arms like that. That means you're not taking communion, and the priest give you a blessing and move
Yeah,
on.
So
I'm
you
not,
want to take communion out of us.
I'm not into bashing Roman Catholics, but I had an experience in the fall. A very dear friend in Fort Worth passed away, so we went to his funeral. And they're a very devout Roman Catholic. And I sat there before it started and was reading the liturgy. It's a very prescribed funeral liturgy. And when it got to the Eucharist, it very clearly said Roman Catholics in good standing only, but you could receive a blessing. And I was going to honor that, and I did. But I found it ironic that the priest's homily was all about how every single person on the planet has been made by God to crave the Eucharist and needs this bread and this wine to live. And how Jim, who passed away, he ate this meal regularly, a lot of times during the week and early mornings, but every Sunday. He said, all of us, we need this. Everybody come to this table. And then we switched to the liturgy, which says you can't. And if it hadn't been a funeral, I probably would have struck up a conversation afterwards, because, you know, you wonder, was this his theology he's preaching, but he has to live by this theology of his church, or was he perfectly fine with that dissonance or not? But, you know, it just struck me as terribly ironic to preach on this and then to not practice it.
Yeah, there are, again, like I said, over the years I was involved in lots of masses, and sometimes traveling with Jesuits to different places where we just had a mass with 10 or 12 of us. They always told me, take communion. You know, they even though they knew it was against their own churches, and you know, so who knows? Like you said, he may have felt different than his own official religion taught. You know, who knows? Your church uses grape juice rather than wine, right?
Yes.
And some churches do that just because issues of abstinence from alcohol, or maybe people have problems with alcohol. I have been in churches. In fact, when I lived in Argentina, I was part of a Baptist church, and they use the trays like you guys do. And in the center of the tray, they'd have wine in the little cups, and on the outside, they'd have grape juice. So you could just take your pick. You know, this was a Baptist church, too.
Was it red wine or white wine?
It was red wine.
Because I've seen white wine.
Yeah, this was red wine, but yeah. Now there's some crazy Baptists who say, well, it wasn't really wine juice that drank it; was fermented. It was unfermented grape juice. And that's bogus. That's bogus. But back early on in the writings of Irenaeus, Augustine, and Epiphanius, all three of these had writings against certain heresies. And there was a heresy that focused in on a few different minor groups that used water instead of wine or grape juice. And Augustine referred to them as Aquarians, calling them those Aquarians who are misusing the body and blood of Christ. And this is what the Mormon Church does, by the way. They use water rather than wine, because they say that the angel Moroni revealed that directly to Joseph Smith to use.
There's a kind of a reverse twist on the lady that you were talking. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. Why? In our tradition, we say you all come. So when a Catholic, somebody from one of these more exclusive traditions comes to our church and refuses participate in the communion service.
Mhm.
Why do they do that?
Because their church tells them not to participate in Protestant communion. We would allow them.
Yeah,
But their church says-
What then? What's,
Their church says do not do it.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the official teaching of the Catholic Church. And the Orthodox churches, they say do not. Orthodox are allowed to take communion in Catholic Church. Catholic said, yeah, but the Orthodox tells their people don't do it. So you got these inner rivalries going, you know, but yeah, everybody in your church would be welcome.
I had an uncle who was Catholic, and if he took communion in our church when he was visiting my parents, and before he could take communion in the Catholic church, he had to go to confession.
Mhm.
When I was in fourth grade, a little girl, a friend, somebody in my Sunday school class brought her cousin to Sunday school. And they said, don't tell anybody that she's here because she's Catholic and she'll go to hell if her priest finds out. That was pre-Vatican II, but I mean, that was, but you were talking about wine. I've taken communion with chapati and chai tea, and I've taken it with Kool-Aid and Girl Scout cookies, and I've taken it, with lots of things. I think it's the substance, not the.
Can you explain number 11?
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. So this really only applies to the Roman Catholic Church. It's not done in the Orthodox churches. But in the Catholic Church, since the body and blood, since the bread and the wine become the actual body and blood of Christ, that sacrament is sometimes reserved in a special place, a special room. It might be a small room with chairs, and people can come and sit before the sacrament because they're sitting before the presence of Christ, since it's literally Christ himself. And that the bread is actually what they call a host, and it's a large host, and it will be placed in a cross with a cutout in the center. It's called a monstrance, and that cross will be up on a table, and people can sit down and give a devotion before the presence of Christ.
This is before the service.
No, it's usually typically it'll be after the service. It'll be there all week,
So it's after you have the polices.
Yeah, exactly. After it's already been blessed and the transformation's already occurred. So people can come throughout the week to venerate the Blessed Sacrament. And sometimes the sacrament will be carried outside into processions. I happened to run into a procession down by St. Therese Church over there one day when all the girls were processing with the bishop, and they had the cross with the monstrance there. They were walking all the way down, I guess, to UMKC and back. Those kinds of processions are much more common outside the United States. I lived in Costa Rica for a year, and I saw them in Costa Rica a lot in Central America. You see them in the Philippines. You see them in countries, third world countries, a lot, where people will reenact the Easter story and some things like that. So in the Catholic Church, these sorts of things are very common. And then the word tabernacle, what I referred to earlier as an aumbry, a place set into the wall where you can store. A tabernacle is actually a freestanding box. And in the Catholic Church, that's where the sacrament will be kept if there's some left over. And that tabernacle will either be sitting on the main altar or it'll be on a side altar in the church. Yeah. Yes, sir.
At Assumption Abbey outside of Eva, Missouri, there's some of us who go fishing down in that area. And we would frequently, most of the time we went to Mass in the early morning, but it moved even earlier. So we decided to go to a 5:30 service. I forget what the title of that service is, but it was spoken of as an adoration.
Mm-hmm.
And so we discovered that the host was brought out, but we didn't partake. The theme was simply to meditate and adore them.
Yeah, that's exactly what this is. Yeah, you're adoring, adorating, venerating. Yeah, that's exactly what this is.
My daughter grew up in this tradition. She joined the Episcopal Church when she lived in New York City, and is now married to a guy who joined the Orthodox tradition, so they go to that tradition now. So what would you counsel her with respect to taking communion?
You know what it says in the creed about the communion of saints?
Say again?
You know, in the creed it says, I believe in the communion of saints.
Yeah.
I call that the circulation of the saints, okay, from one church to another. If she's Orthodox now, then, she can take communion in the Orthodox church, you know? Yeah.
We don't have to.
But what would,
What would I advise her?
when she comes to this institution?
Oh, when she comes here,
There's a certain
the
amount of
Eastern
distance
the
there.
Eastern church will tell her, don't take communion here.
Yeah,
That's what they'll tell her, but you would tell her she's welcome here.
yeah.
Okay, I'll see you at 8 o'clock, so Mike, I'm gonna turn it
Well,
back
thank
over
you,
to you. Yeah.